The notification lit up the phone screen on the mahogany table, slicing through the dim, candlelit intimacy of the room like a cold blade. It was a message that should have been sent 3 months ago, or perhaps never at all. 3 words that carried the weight of a marriage destroyed and a regret realized too late. But the eyes reading that screen didn't belong to a lonely man waiting in the dark. They belonged to two people who knew exactly what betrayal tasted like. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet devastation of a love lost and the dangerous, intricate paths of healing that follow, stay with me. There are still many secrets left to uncover in the silence between these lines. The sound of packing tape ripping against the dispenser was the loudest thing in the apartment. It was a sharp, tearing screech that seemed to slice through the humid July air of Seattle, punctuating the silence that had settled over Julian Vance's life. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the living room, his back to the chaos. Outside, the rain was doing what it always did, blurring the city lights into streaks of mercury and gold. He focused on the taillights of cars moving sluggishly along I-5, trying to anchor himself to the rhythm of the traffic. Because if he turned around, he would have to accept that his 5-year marriage was ending in a series of cardboard boxes. "I think that's the last of the books," Elara said. Her voice was soft, laced with that terrifying, pitying gentleness that hurts more than anger. Julian turned. Elara was kneeling on the hardwood floor, sealing a medium-sized box marked "Studio." Her dark hair fell over her face, hiding her eyes. She looked beautiful, even now. Especially now. There was a flush to her cheeks, a subtle vibration of energy that Julian hadn't seen in 2 years. It was the energy of escape. "You're taking the art books?" Julian asked. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, dry, detached, like he was speaking through a layer of cotton. Elara paused, her hand resting on the cardboard. "They were mostly mine, Julian, from before." "Right. Before." Before meant before him. Before meant the time she was now running back to. He watched her stand up and brush the dust off her jeans. She looked around the apartment, the minimalist furniture, the recessed lighting, the carefully curated life they had built. It was a beautiful cage, she had told him last night. Safe, predictable, suffocating. "Adrian is downstairs," she said, not meeting his eyes. The name landed between them like a stone dropped in a quiet pond. Adrian, the man she had dated in her 20s, the man who broke her heart, the man who had now returned as the supposed savior of her soul. "Couldn't he wait in the car?" Julian asked, a flash of bitterness finally breaking through his numbness. "He wanted to help carry things down. I told him no." Elara finally looked at him. Her eyes were wide, pleading for him to understand something he knew he never would. "Julian, please don't look at me like I'm a villain. I'm trying to save us both from a lifetime of pretending." "I wasn't pretending," Julian said quietly. Elara flinched. She grabbed her purse from the kitchen island, her knuckles white against the leather. "I know. That's why it's unfair to you. You deserve someone who is content with peace. I can't do the quiet anymore. I need to feel something, even if it burns." "Fire burns out, Elara," he warned, the architect in him speaking. He knew about foundations, about structural integrity. He knew that things built on impulse rarely withstood the weather. "Maybe," she whispered, walking toward the door. She stopped, her hand hovering over the handle. "But at least it's warm." She opened the door. The hallway light spilled in, harsh and artificial. She didn't look back. She didn't say goodbye. She just walked out, trailing the faint scent of the jasmine perfume he had bought her for their anniversary. Julian stood frozen until the latch clicked shut. He was alone. He walked over to the kitchen island where she had been standing. She had left her key. It sat on the marble counter, a small, jagged piece of metal that no longer unlocked anything. Beside it was a half-drunk cup of tea, still warm.
Down on the street, 3 stories below, a car door slammed. It was a heavy, expensive sound. Julian moved back to the window just in time to see a sleek black Range Rover pull away from the curb. He saw the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat, Adrian, and saw Ilara slide into the passenger side. The brake lights flared red, illuminating the rain for a brief second, and then they were gone, merging into the endless stream of traffic. Julian pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The apartment was silent now. The sound of the tape was gone, replaced by the humming of the refrigerator and the distant sirens of the city. He looked at the reflection of the empty room behind him in the window. It wasn't just that she had left. It was that she had left him for a memory, convinced that the past held more life than their future. He reached for his phone, purely out of habit, to check the time. 8:12 p.m. 3 months. He told himself he just had to get through the next hour, then the next. But as he stared at the rain, he couldn't help but wonder if she was already laughing in that car, if the fire she wanted was already consuming the memory of him. He didn't know yet that fire leaves ashes, and ashes, when mixed with rain, turn into something else entirely.
The first thing Julian learned about being alone was that silence had a texture. It wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a physical weight that settled into the corners of the apartment, heavy and gray like the Seattle fog pressing against the glass. It had been 4 weeks. The logistics of heartbreak were surprisingly bureaucratic. Julian sat at the kitchen island, the same spot where he had watched her leave, with a stack of mail. Uncoupling was a tedious process of untangling digital and financial knots. He had spent 20 minutes on hold with the utility company just to remove her name from the electric bill. When the representative finally confirmed the change, saying, "You are now the sole account holder, Mr. Vance," the finality of it hit him harder than the slam of the door had. He looked at his phone. The shared calendar notification popped up. Dinner with the Davises. It was a recurring event he hadn't deleted yet. He swiped it away, deleting the future they were supposed to have, one notification at a time. He walked into the bedroom. He had stopped sleeping in the bed after the third night. The California King felt absurdly vast for one person. Instead, he had been sleeping on the leather sofa in the den, wrapped in a throw blanket, waking up with a stiff neck but a slightly less hollow chest. The bedroom still smelled like her, that faint mix of expensive jasmine and dry shampoo. He closed the door, sealing the ghost inside. Julian was a landscape architect. His job was to impose order on nature, to create flow and purpose out of chaos. But looking at his own life, he saw only overgrown weeds and broken pathways. He put on his coat and left the apartment, simply because the walls felt like they were moving closer. Across the city, the atmosphere was electric. The noise in the private lounge of the Nest was deafening, a cacophony of clinking crystal and bass-heavy ambient music. Ilara sat in a velvet booth, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand. The view from the rooftop bar was spectacular, overlooking Elliott Bay. But Ilara wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at Adrian. He was holding court, surrounded by 3 potential investors for his new fintech startup. He looked incredible. Sharp suit, unbuttoned collar, eyes bright with the thrill of the deal. This was the adrenaline she had craved, the man who commanded the room. "And that's why we pivot in Q3, Adrian said, his voice carrying effortlessly. The group laughed, captivated. Ilara smiled, shifting in her seat. Her heels were pinching her toes, a sharp, rhythmic pain she had been ignoring for 2 hours. She reached for a piece of sushi, but Adrian's hand gently touched her wrist. "Wait for the toast, babe," he murmured, barely looking at her, his eyes still locked at the investor to his left. It was a small thing, a micro-correction, but it made Ilara's hand freeze. With Julian, dinner had been a shared ritual. He would ask her about her day, about the gallery artists, about her thoughts. Here, she was scenery. She was the beautiful woman next to the successful man, a prop to signal his virility and status. She retracted her hand. "Right, the toast." Adrian finally raised his glass. "To new ventures," he announced. "To new ventures," the table echoed. Ilara drank. The champagne was cold and crisp, but it settled uneasily in her stomach. Later that night, back at Adrian's penthouse in Bellevue, the dynamic didn't shift. The apartment was a glass box in the sky. Cold, modern, impressive, and utterly devoid of warmth.
There were no books, no art that wasn't bought for investment purposes. Adrian loosened his tie, scrolling through his phone as he walked toward the bedroom. Great night. Did you see how Harris looked at me when I mentioned the valuation? He's in. I can feel it. You were great, Alara said, leaning against the doorframe. She wanted him to ask if she had a good time. She wanted him to notice that she had been quiet for the last hour of the evening. I'm going to crash. 5 a.m. call with Tokyo, Adrian said, not looking up. He didn't ask her to join him. He didn't kiss her goodnight. He just disappeared into the master suite, the blue light of his phone illuminating his face. Alara stood in the living room. The silence here was different from the silence in Julian's apartment. It wasn't heavy with grief. It was sharp with indifference. She walked to the massive window. She could see the faint glow of downtown Seattle across the water. Somewhere over there, in the apartment that she had abandoned, was a man who used to warm her towel on the radiator before she got out of the shower. A man who used to listen. She shook her head, physically shaking off the thought. No, she told herself. That was boredom. This is excitement. This is what winning looks like. She turned away from the window, ignoring the gnawing feeling in her gut that felt suspiciously like loneliness, and went to pour herself another glass of wine. She wasn't ready to sleep yet. The silence was too loud. In Seattle, Julian walked through the drizzle, his hands deep in his pockets. He passed a bistro where he and Alara used to have brunch. He saw a couple in the window, laughing over a shared dessert. He looked away, his jaw tightening. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just tired. He realized then that the hardest part wasn't the leaving, it was the staying. She had left, but he was the one who had to stay in the ruins and figure out how to rebuild the foundation. He took a deep breath of the wet, pine-scented air. Tomorrow he would have to go to the office. He would have to answer the polite, pitying questions from coworkers. But for tonight, he just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, moving through the gray city that felt as empty as his chest.
2 weeks after the electric bill was transferred solely to Julian's name, he was required to attend the annual Architecture and Design Gala hosted by his firm, Vance and Partners. The irony of celebrating structure's instability when his own life had been condemned was not lost on him. He considered sending his junior partner, but the mandatory attendance felt like a necessary penance, a forced re-entry into the world of the living. He arrived at the venue, a sleek museum space overlooking Puget Sound, dressed in a tuxedo that suddenly felt too formal, too much like armor. The air buzzed with professional chatter and the clinking of champagne flutes. Julian navigated the room with practiced ease, exchanging smiles and professional nods, answering the carefully phrased inquiries about Alara. Just a sabbatical, he heard himself say to his senior partner, lying smoothly, believing the lie made the betrayal smaller, more manageable. She needed a break from the gallery scene. He found a quiet spot near a minimalist sculpture garden, nursing a whiskey that did little to quiet the persistent hum of loneliness. It was there, framed against a stark white wall, that he saw her. She was standing alone, observing a piece of kinetic art that pulsed with quiet movement. Julian knew her immediately, despite only seeing her once, and a distant, blurred photograph on Adrian's social media feed, deleted mere hours before Adrian and Alara went public. This was Sophie Merritt, Adrian's ex-fiancée, the doctor he had discarded almost as carelessly as he had discarded Alara's feelings. She was wearing a gown the color of deep sapphire, simple and sharp, conveying strength without effort. When she finally turned, their eyes met. Julian felt a strange jolt. It wasn't attraction, but recognition. They were two people who had once shared a future, albeit with different partners, only to have that future obliterated by the same arrogant, charming force. Julian hesitated, then felt the sudden, undeniable pull of morbid curiosity. He walked toward her. "Dr. Merritt?" he asked, extending his hand. Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly, then softened with understanding that was almost painful. She took his hand. Her grip was firm, professional. "Mr. Vance, Julian, you were Alara's husband, and you were Adrian's fiancé." Julian finished for her. "Yes, it seems we share a rather specific trauma." Sophie's voice was low, devoid of self-pity, but edged with the steel of a person who had fought hard to regain her composure. Julian managed to wry smile. "It's a small city, Seattle, or maybe Adrian just enjoys collecting the same kind of collateral damage." Sophie laughed, a short, dry sound that resonated with his own cynicism.
He certainly has a type. The type that values stability until he tires of it, and the type he promises the world to until he finds a better offer. She didn't try to soften the blow for Julian. She treated their shared history as a factual ailment, a diagnosis they both understood. This was strangely comforting. Alara's friends had offered platitudes and reassurances. Sophie offered the common language of Ash. "What are you doing here tonight?" Julian asked. "My hospital system is a major benefactor. I'm here because I have to be," she said, raising her champagne glass in a mock salute. "I suspect you're here for the same reason. Duty. Or perhaps to prove to the world and yourself that you still exist. Perhaps both." They talked for 20 minutes, leaning against the cold marble balustrade. They didn't talk about Adrian or Laura much, but their conversation was entirely about them. They spoke of the quiet toxicity of being with someone who constantly seeks validation through risk, and the slow, insidious realization that you are never the destination, only a comfortable stopover. Julian found himself telling her about the sound of the packing tape, a detail he hadn't shared with anyone. "It's the small things that break you," Sophie agreed, her gaze distant. "The way he left a half-full bag of espresso beans and never came back for them. You realize you're not dealing with malice, just utter carelessness." Their conversation was an antidote to the isolation. Julian realized he wasn't talking to a potential romantic interest, but to a peer, a fellow survivor who understood the specific weight of Adrian's betrayal. As the crowd swelled, an acquaintance approached Sophie, calling her back to her table. Sophie turned to Julian, her expression now purely professional. "It was necessary, Julian, to confirm that the narrative I was told was universal. At least now we both know that we weren't crazy." "No," Julian agreed, feeling a genuine lightness he hadn't felt in months. "Just victims of poor character judgment." Sophie offered him a faint smile, a genuine crack in her armor, and walked away. He watched her go, then finally finished his whiskey. The room still buzzed, but the silence inside him was less desolate. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't alone in his loss. He was merely part of a broader pattern. And knowing the pattern meant he could start drawing his own lines. He was still in the ruins, but now he had met someone else who knew how to shovel.
The forced formality of the gala was gone, replaced by the casual anonymity of a downtown Seattle coffee shop. Julian sat across from Sophie 2 days later, the sound of the espresso machine providing a welcome buffer to the intimacy of their conversation. Their meeting hadn't been planned. A simple, pragmatic text message from Sophie. "Want to compare notes on the collateral damage? I'm free Tuesday." "I still can't figure out what I was missing," Julian admitted, stirring his coffee slowly. "The house was built, the plans were sound. I thought the quiet was contentment." Sophie set down her mug. She had traded her evening gown for the sensible, functional attire of an emergency room doctor, scrubs beneath a sharp trench coat. "You weren't missing anything, Julian. You were being stable. And stability is boring to people who equate volatility with feeling alive. Adrian is a master at creating drama to distract from his own lack of substance. He promises a firework, but he's just a fire hazard." Her bluntness was a strange relief. It bypassed the need for delicate self-pity. They talked not of love or healing, but of observation. They discussed the psychology of their ex-partners, trading anecdotes about Adrian's grand gestures that masked minimal effort and Alara's constant, subtle need for external validation. Julian found himself analyzing Alara's departure with the precision of an architectural review, stripping away the emotion to look at the structural failure. She wanted the chaos, Julian concluded, leaning back, and now she has it. He didn't know how much chaos Alara truly had, but he could imagine. In Adrian's penthouse, Alara was navigating the third consecutive morning where Adrian was on a pre-dawn call with Hong Kong, barely acknowledging her existence. The romance of the glass wall department was fading fast, revealing its clinical emptiness. She dressed quietly, standing in the enormous walk-in closet that held her clothes and a dizzying array of Adrian's untouched, expensive suits. She had left her life of elegant curation for this life of careless luxury, but the luxury felt transactional. Adrian bought her things, a bracelet, a ticket to Miami, a new handbag, but he never saw her. Last night, she had attempted to discuss her gallery's upcoming budget cuts.
Adrian had smiled vaguely, kissed her forehead, and immediately checked his stock ticker. "You'll figure it out, babe. You're smart. Don't sweat the small stuff." The small stuff, Alara realized with a sinking heart, was everything that mattered. She walked out to the living area. Adrian was pacing, his voice loud and emphatic in Cantonese. Alara picked up her phone, instinctively scrolling through Instagram. She saw a sponsored post for a new home fragrance Julian had once mentioned wanting. Then, buried deep in a friend's travel feed, she saw a photo, a subtle, almost accidental shot of the architecture gala from weeks ago. Julian was in the background, and beside him, laughing at something he'd said, was Sophie Merritt. The sight jolted Alara more than any direct confrontation could have. It wasn't the proximity that stung. It was the shared ease. Julian looked relaxed, not destroyed, not grieving the way she had expected him to perpetually grieve. He looked like he was being truly seen. The realization hit her like a punch. Her leaving hadn't ruined Julian's life. It had simply made room for the next, perhaps better iteration of it. And the person helping him build it was Adrian's own collateral damage. The universe, it seemed, had a deeply ironic sense of humor. Alara quickly minimized the app, her breath catching in her throat. She needed to tell herself Julian was just networking, but the image of their faces, two people standing shoulder to shoulder, connected by a quiet understanding, was a mirror, reflecting her own failure back at her. "What's wrong?" Adrian's voice cut in, now speaking English, abrupt and annoyed. "Nothing," Alara said quickly, stuffing the phone into her pocket. "Just realized I left a file at the gallery." "Right. Look, if you're going out, can you grab me that specific cold brew they have downtown, the organic one? I'm slammed today." He handed her his wallet without looking. "Keep the change." Alara took the wallet. It was a gesture of ownership, not partnership. As she left the gloss penthouse, the sting of being an errand runner was quickly subsumed by the cold realization that she had thrown away a man who made her tea to be with a man who handed her cash. The chaos she desired was simply the chaos of being an afterthought. Back in the coffee shop, Julian was wrapping up his conversation with Sophie. "Thank you simply. This was better than therapy." Sophie smiled, zipping up her coat. "The comfort of knowing you're not the only idiot helps, doesn't it? If you need a partner in crime for the next administrative horror, call me." Julian nodded, watching her stride purposefully down the street. He felt a sense of anticipation, not for romance, but for the quiet, steady work of rebuilding. The silence in his apartment no longer felt like a grave. It felt like a space, finally ready for a new blueprint.
Julian was working late on a pro bono project for a community garden, a welcome, grounding distraction. He was sketching drainage plans when his phone buzzed. It wasn't Sophie, but a text from his old friend Mark, who still occasionally saw Alara at gallery events. "Heard Alara's big auction piece got canceled last minute? Bad logistics from the seller. Tough break." Julian paused, the drafting pencil hovering over the vellum. The cancellation wasn't just a tough break, it was a major blow to the gallery's prestige and Alara's reputation. Alara had been relying on Adrian's supposed connections to secure high-profile logistics for the seller. Julian knew, instinctively, that Adrian had promised far more than he had delivered, then dropped the ball the moment the task required genuine effort. The news stirred a complex mix of emotions. A flicker of protective concern for the woman he used to love, immediately followed by the cold realization that Adrian's chaos had finally impacted Alara's career, the one part of her life she guarded most fiercely. A few hours later, Sophie arrived. She had offered to help him organize a towering stack of outdated permits. It was a bizarre way to spend a Friday evening, but it felt strangely normal. There was no pressure, no performance, just the shared, quiet satisfaction of organizing other people's problems. "What's wrong?" she asked, catching the shadow of concern on his face.
Julian told her about the canceled auction piece. Sophie's eyes hardened with recognition. That's Adrian's signature move. Grand promises, zero follow-through. He probably outsourced the logistics to his newest intern and never checked the contract language. He doesn't deal with the mundane. He just deals with the idea of success. It hurts her, Julian murmured. That piece was supposed to be the launch for the fall season. And that, Sophie said, pushing a box of archived blueprints towards him, is the price of choosing the fire hazard. You can't be surprised when the house burns down. You can only decide if you want to stand in the rain or start building a new shelter. Her clarity was a gift. It was the moment their relationship fully shifted. It was no longer about Adrian. It was about the structure they were building for themselves, a structure of trust, honesty, and small shared efforts. Later, sitting on the rooftop deck of his apartment, sharing a bottle of wine, Julian asked her about her job. She spoke about the intensity of the ER, the high stakes, and the necessity of immediate, correct decisions. It makes everything outside the hospital feel slow, Sophie confessed. It's hard to commit to things that don't have immediate, measurable outcomes. Like building a relationship, Julian suggested. Exactly, she confirmed, looking out over the city lights. I was terrified of Julian's pace. Adrian felt fast, like the ER, but the adrenaline always drops, and then you realize you're just patching up wounds without ever healing the underlying condition. Julian reached out, not hesitating this time, and touched her hand. The gesture was tentative, not fueled by passion, but by profound respect and mutual understanding. It weighed a feather, yet felt as monumental as moving a mountain. Across town, Ilara was reeling. She was back at Adrian's penthouse, waiting for him to finish an evening Zoom call. The gallery auction disaster had been confirmed that morning. The blame had fallen squarely on her department for poor vetting, even though she had been assured by Adrian 3 weeks prior that his contacts had smoothed everything out. When Adrian finally emerged, he was annoyed but dismissive. It's a glitch, Ilara. We pivot. Who cares about one rusty antique? I care, Adrian, Ilara shot back, her voice shaking. It's my career. You told me your guy had it under control. We lost a 6-figure commission and damaged our reputation with the seller. Adrian sighed, pouring a whiskey. Don't be dramatic. I'll make a call. I'll buy the seller dinner. It's done. You need to relax. Why are you always so high-strung? His words, high-strung, dramatic, relax, were not the passionate, accepting vocabulary of the man she had run to. They were the patronizing dismissals of a man whose primary goal was his own peace and convenience. Ilara looked at him, truly looked, and saw a shallow mirror of her own worst traits: impatience, self-absorption, and a constant need for excitement to mask deep insecurity. This wasn't fire. This was just the heat of friction. I'm leaving, Ilara announced abruptly. Adrian didn't even look up from his glass. Fine, but I have that early flight to Tokyo. Don't forget your toothbrush. The sheer indifference of his response was the final, devastating blow. He wasn't even fighting for her to stay. He was just confirming that her presence was optional, her absence irrelevant. The fantasy she had chased had not only burned out, but it had left her stranded, professionally humiliated, and emotionally starving. She drove away from the dazzling glass tower that night, not towards her gallery, but to a quiet, unfamiliar park overlooking the city. She pulled out her phone. Julian's number was still saved. She stared at the screen. The longing for safety, stability, and genuine care overwhelmed her pride. She started typing. I miss you. The text was a desperate plea for rescue, the final, inevitable move in her game of self-destruction.
The crisp night air of the park did little to cool the heat of Alara's humiliation. She sat in her car, the engine silent, the city stretching out below her like a million indifferent, glittering possibilities she had forfeited. She had spent the last 3 months chasing the illusion of a full life, only to find herself professionally diminished and personally discarded. Adrian's already on his flight to Tokyo, having left a brief robotic text confirming his departure and reminding her to feed his tropical fish. The contrast with Julian, who once took a 3-hour detour just to bring her favorite soup when she had a flu, was a physical ache in her chest. She picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over Julian's contact. She remembered the look on his face the night she left, not angry but utterly hollowed out. A good man, a truly good man, whom she had treated as disposable comfort. She thought of the canceled auction piece, the public embarrassment, the way Adrian had dismissed her pain as drama. She needed an anchor. She needed Julian's silence, his calm, his absolute safety. It was selfish, she knew, but the need for rescue was paralyzing. She typed quickly, before the last vestiges of her pride could intervene. "I miss you. Can we talk?" She stared at the screen for a full minute, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed send. The sound of the notification tone was sharp in the quiet car. Then she threw the phone onto the passenger seat, closing her eyes, bracing herself for the response, the long, terrible wait. But the text would not be received in the quiet apartment she imagined. Across town, Julian and Sophie were doing what they hadn't done since the day they met, attending the major social event of the Pacific Northwest Art Foundation Gala, ironically being held at the very museum where Alara had once been a curator. Julian looked effortless in his tuxedo. His confidence was quiet and self-assured, not from external validation, but from the difficult, steady work of internal repair. Sophie was on his arm, the sapphire gown from their first meeting replaced by a stunning deep emerald dress that made her look like the only patch of unclouded sky in Seattle. They were talking to the foundation's director, discussing Julian's upcoming project for the city park revitalization. There was a genuine, easy synergy between them. Sophie would add a point about community health impact, and Julian would elaborate on the sustainable design. They were a team, a structure built on shared values and mutual respect, not fleeting passion. "You two make a formidable pair," the director commented warmly. Julian smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached his eyes. "We understand the necessity of a strong foundation." Sophie squeezed his arm lightly, a gesture of affirmation that felt profound. It wasn't the manic energy Alara had brought to social settings. It was a deep, resting comfort. They moved toward the central bar, their conversation drifting toward a shared cynical critique of the abstract art installations. Julian placed his phone on the polished marble counter, right between them as he signaled the bartender. It was exactly 9:48 p.m. The screen lit up. A notification flashed across the lock screen, stark white against the dark glass. "Alara, V. I miss you. Can we talk?" The light was undeniable, pulling both of their eyes toward the message. The screen was positioned perfectly for both of them to read the words simultaneously. Julian froze. The ice clinked gently in the glass the bartender set before him, the only sound in his suddenly suspended world. The name Alara V and the 3 devastating words that followed demanded an immediate emotional response. Grief, relief, or anger. But Julian felt none of those. He felt a profound stillness, the kind of detachment that comes from seeing a catastrophic event long after the danger has passed. Sophie did not gasp. She did not snatch up the phone. She simply looked at the message, then, slowly, deliberately raised her eyes to meet Julian's. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a shared weary understanding of Adrian's pattern repeating itself. She knew exactly what this text meant. It meant the honeymoon was over. It meant the fire had consumed the scenery, and now the architect was needed to clean up the rubble. She was one of the 2 familiar faces who had met the desperation of the text. Julian was the other. He looked at the message, then at Sophie. In the deep emerald of her dress and the steady, clear intelligence of her eyes, he saw the future he was building. In the text, he saw the ghost of the life he had finally truly mourned and moved past. Without a word, Julian reached out, not toward the phone, but to the glass of whiskey. He lifted it to his lips, took a slow sip, and then, very calmly, he used his thumb to push the lock button on the phone, turning the screen dark. The message remained unanswered. The 2 familiar faces turned back to the bar, and the noise of the gala washed back in, reclaiming the moment.
The ambient music of the gala felt miles away. Julian stood perfectly still, the cool glass of the whiskey press chilling his fingertips, his phone face down on the marble counter. The silent black rectangle was the most volatile thing in the room, a time capsule of regret that had just been opened. Sophie waited. She didn't prompt him, didn't offer advice, or even place a hand on his back. That silence was the most eloquent communication Julian had received all night. It affirmed his autonomy and respected the magnitude of the choice. She understood that this was Julian's test, and his resolution had to be his own. Julian took a breath, letting the moment stretch out. He wasn't thinking about Alara or Adrian or the details of the past. He was thinking about the community garden plans on his desk, about the honest laughter he shared with Sophie over bureaucratic nonsense, about the quiet relief of being with someone who didn't mistake chaos for life. He looked at Sophie. She always preferred the drama of a rescue, he said, his voice low and steady. She needs someone to rush in, to forgive her failure, to provide the stability she can't generate herself. And that's not you anymore, Sophie finished, her voice a calm echo of his conviction. No, Julian confirmed. That man died the night she closed the door. He picked up his glass, finished the whiskey, and placed the glass back down with a definitive clink. Then, deliberately, he turned his full attention back to Sophie. The foundation director mentioned wanting to link the park design to the hospital's wellness program. You have an opinion on pedestrian flow and recovery rates, don't you, doctor? Julian asked, his tone shifting back to the professional, the present, the shared future. Sophie's eyes flickered with approval, not just for his choice, but for the swift, clean execution of it. She recognized the discipline it took to turn away from a powerful emotional trigger. I do, Sophie replied, her voice firm. We need clear, open sightlines. High-stress environments benefit from structural simplicity. They moved away from the bar, the phone forgotten. They began discussing the logistics of municipal design and public health, the mundane topic serving as a powerful shield against the emotional turbulence Alara had tried to unleash. They were creating a new foundation, and the materials were solid, chosen not for their flash, but for their resilience. Meanwhile, Alara sat in her silent car, staring at the darkened screen. 1 minute passed, 5 minutes, 10. The silence on the other end was a physical blow. It wasn't the rejection she feared, it was the lack of reaction she hadn't anticipated. Julian always reacted. He always answered. His silence spoke 1,000 words, none of them forgiving. It said, I have moved beyond your orbit. Your drama no longer has gravitational pull. The cold realization that she had lost the rescue boat and that the person steering it was busy talking about sustainable development with Adrian's other casualty began to dawn on her. The shame deepened, morphing into a cold, desolate panic. She drove back to the glass penthouse, the temporary refuge that now felt more like a prison. The luxury was hollow, the view was empty. She looked at Adrian's fish tank, the colorful, exotic fish moving in their own silent, artificial world. She pulled out her phone and saw no new message. She opened the text app. The 3 words, I miss you, stared back at her, radiating desperation. She typed out another message, an excuse, a question, anything, to fill the void, but deleted it all. She had exhausted her currency. Julian and Sophie, later that night, stood in the vestibule of the museum waiting for their ride. They were laughing about a mutual acquaintance whose architectural submission had been suspiciously Baroque. It just lacked integrity, Julian commented, shaking his head. A lot of things do, but you can always start over. You just need to know which walls to keep. Julian didn't need to check his phone. He knew it was still dark. The code was unanswered, and in the space of that silence, the debris of the past 3 months had finally settled. He was clean. He was whole. He was ready to walk into the next chapter, not alone, but with someone who understood the price of a strong foundation. 2 days after the unanswered text, Alara stood outside the familiar mahogany door of the Seattle apartment. She had called, but Julian hadn't picked up. She had sent a carefully worded, slightly more formal email, suggesting they meet for coffee to discuss logistics. He had replied with a curt, single-line email, confirming a time for her to collect her remaining items.
The tone was professional, distant, and utterly devoid of the warmth she desperately needed. She used the emergency code she still remembered, and the heavy door clicked open. The apartment was immaculate, too immaculate. The few items she had left, a stack of old photo albums, a forgotten sketch pad, were neatly boxed by the door, labeled Alara in bold, impersonal marker. The air no longer carried the scent of her jasmine perfume. It smelled faintly of fresh paint and wood polish. Her ghost had been thoroughly evicted. Julian was in the kitchen, wiping down the marble counter. He wore a simple gray sweatshirt, his usual armor of a button-down shirt abandoned. He looked different, not thinner, but lighter. The persistent tension around his eyes finally eased. "Thank you for coming," Julian said, his tone polite, suitable for a difficult client, not a spouse. He didn't offer coffee, he didn't offer a seat. "Julian," Alara began, her voice cracking slightly. She walked toward him, dropping her purse. I know I was awful. Adrian, he's not what I thought. It was a mistake. A spectacular, cruel mistake. I want to apologize properly, not just for the logistics." She tried to reach for his hand, but Julian stepped back, placing the kitchen towel neatly on the counter. The rejection was physical, immediate, and utterly overwhelming. "I accept your apology, Alara," he said, "and I forgive you, but forgiveness is for me, not for us. There is no us anymore." Alara felt the cold certainty of his words wash over her. "But we had 5 years, Julian. You were my best friend. We can rebuild. I'm ready to stop chasing the excitement. I just need safety, and I need you." "You don't need safety, Alara," Julian replied, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You need a constant safety net, and I was tired of being on call for your life. And I'm not a building you can tear down for a dramatic renovation and then expect to move back into when the foundation of the new place fails." He moved to the small table in the corner, where they used to share takeout. On it, placed deliberately, was a simple silver picture frame. It wasn't a photo of them. It was a recent snapshot of Julian and Sophie. They were outside, laughing, both wearing construction helmets, pointing at a large plot of cleared land, the future community garden site. They looked like partners, grounded, focused, and genuinely happy. Alara stared at the photo. Sophie's sapphire eyes met hers, delivering the silent, final verdict. The two familiar faces had not just met her text, but had absorbed it, analyzed it, and rejected it without fanfare. "Sophie," Alara whispered, the name tasting like ash. "Adrian's ex." "Yes," Julian confirmed. "We found we had a shared interest in avoiding toxic people. She understands the necessity of structural integrity. We're building something new, Alara. Something honest." He picked up the box marked Alara. "Your things are here. You need to take them now. I have a meeting." The absolute dignity and calm finality of his tone broke Alara. There were no tears, no hysterics, just a hollow emptiness as she grasped the profound loss, not of a husband, but of the chance to undo her own colossal error. She took the box. It was surprisingly light. Is this what you wanted?" Alara asked, her voice a thin thread. Julian looked past her, toward the bright, clear light coming through the window. "I wanted stability, Alara, and I wanted to be chosen, not just defaulted to. I have those things now. The price of your passion was my freedom to build." He opened the door for her. The silence of the apartment was no longer Julian's burden. It was Alara's inheritance. She walked out and down the hall. When she reached the elevator, she looked back. The door was already closed. The latch clicked. Silent and resolute. Alara found herself on the street, the box heavy in her arms. Julian was gone. The only things left were the consequences of her choices and the image of two familiar faces standing together on new ground. She was alone, finally facing the reality that sometimes running back to the past means destroying the one perfect structure that was waiting in the future.